Today I'm going to be talking about another touchy-feely subject. This one is about what it was like for me growing up in the 1950s and 60s as a young kid, where we had firearms in the house. We always sort of think of New Zealand as being a no-gun country compared to a lot of other countries. Now, that's not altogether true. Currently, all gun owners are required to have a gun license. Now, it's the owner that's actually required to have the license. Now, this is a result of the Arms Act that came into New Zealand, that was introduced in 1983. Now, as a result of the Arms Act, all owners require a gun license. Under this act, there are bans on most semi-automatics and high-capacity magazines, but there are limited exceptions for pest control or pest collection. Now, it's not the gun that has to be licensed, it's the person that has to be licensed as a gun owner. And by the way, sorry about these sunglasses, it is me. I did come down to this sports ground thinking that I would be able to sort of get out and wander around, but it's blowing a gale and there's cars and people everywhere, so I've opted just to do this sitting in the car. When anybody wants to get a firearm in New Zealand, the owner is vetted by the police, and plus they have to have a home inspection. And that's to ensure that there is secure storage set up in the house before the license is actually issued. And as I said, there's no limit on the number of guns that a registered owner can have. Now, if you want to practice shooting, but if you want to practice using a firearm but you don't have a license, you're not licensed, you can do this under the watchful eye of a supervisor. Now, the supervisor must be present and actively supervising that person at all times while they're using that firearm. They must be in a position where they can take immediate control of the firearm used by the person who is in possession of that firearm. And they're not allowed to be using another firearm while they are supervising that person whom they are supervising with the use of a firearm. Now, that's just a brief summary of this Arms Act. There's a whole lot more involved in it, but that's just basically the summary of it. Now, our police here aren't armed. They do have, I understand they do have firearms in their vehicles in a lockbox, but they don't carry them around with them. I'm not quite sure whether that's the same with what's the name of that group? Yeah, I'm not sure if, I presume that this particular group are allowed to carry firearms, but I guess that's just in an active situation. Now, the reason I just bring this all up, these rules and regulations that have come in since the Arms Act of 1983, prior to that, it was pretty loosey-goosey on what you could do with a firearm. Now, when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, Mum and Dad always had firearms at the house. Now, we lived on a farm. Dad worked on a farm. And so there was plenty of area around the place. And Mum and Dad used to go shooting or hunting quite a lot. And sometimes we would go with them. Now, the times I used to go with Dad, not far away from the farm where we were, there was some hills covered in bush. And we would go up there and Dad would go hunting wild goats. Now, wild goats are very destructive to the environment, especially with New Zealand's lush bush, and they are a real pest. So we never used to eat the goats. No. But he used to go hunting, and if he got the opportunity, he would snag a wild goat. We also used to go with them when he would go hunting rabbits. Now, this was always on the farm we would go, because there was a lot of rabbits around and they were a little pest. So we used to go with Dad, and we'd sort of walk behind him, and he always had very strict instructions when we went out with him about where we stood, where we were behind him, and also about how he carried his firearm. And he was always an absolute stickler for the rules on the proper way to handle a firearm. Now, I couldn't tell you exactly what sort of guns they were, or what sort of firearms they were, but from my memory, I remember they used to have a 22. Now, that would have been a rifle, I imagine. And from my memory, I can pull the idea that he had a shotgun. Now, I remember him saying it was a side-by-side shotgun, not an over and under. So any gun experts will probably get the gist of what I'm talking about. And I'm going back now to the 1950s, 60s, so on. Now, also here in New Zealand, or as time went by, Dad always had a firearm. Once we moved off the farm and we moved into town, he still maintained the possession of a firearm. Now, him and Mum were both very good with the firearm. Mum was a bit of a crack shot until her eyesight started to fade on her a wee bit, and she lost a bit of interest at that stage. It was no good carrying on. She couldn't see properly. Well, she could see, but not as she would have needed to for using a firearm. From what I remember, I don't ever recall ear protection or eye protection on Dad and Mum or us kids, but that's just the way that it was. And we would like going out with Dad, and most of the time it was with Dad. Occasionally Mum would come, but it was always with Dad. Now, in later years, as I said, when we moved off the farm and into town, he maintained his, kept his guns, his firearms. I need to keep saying firearms, because he was always a keen duck shooter. Now, here in New Zealand, we have an official duck shooting season in May, and it was always the 1st of May. You could hear in the distance all these firearms going off when people were out getting ducks, and ducks used to be an absolute pain, and they used to try and thin them out. These are wild ducks. Go and thin them out, and so that was the official duck shooting season every year. Went out with them a couple of times, and you'd get out there and you'd get close to the lake and you'd build what they call a mai. And it was like you'd build this little hut thing out of branches and everything, and you'd get inside it, and then you could peer out onto the lake, and you could see the ducks coming into the river or on the lake or wherever. And I do remember too that because it was May and it was coming into winter a wee bit, it was getting a bit cooler. There was always sort of a hip flask of whiskey that Dad had, and I keep thinking, oh dear, the things that we used to do. But he would only have it for warmth, not for any other reason. So anyway, that probably sends a chill up many people. So yeah, he used to go duck shooting every year, and I remember once he had a golden Labrador, was his retriever, and if he went to the river and managed to snag a duck or two, the dog would go into the river and bring the duck back out. One day he came home, he was quite distraught. He thought he'd lost his dog, and he'd shot this duck, and it came into the water, and then it sort of went under like a bit of log or a bit of drifting wood or something like that, and the dog went in after it, and the dog didn't resurface again, and Dad was in a real panic, and he said, blow me down, before too much longer the dog come up, and of course he had the duck in its mouth and come out, and Dad said he's never been so relieved in his life when this dog turned up back on the bank with his duck in its mouth. And we would eat these wild ducks, and I used to hate them because we'd always be finding little lead pellets in them, and I just hated them. Even now, I won't eat duck. I never eat duck. So that's a memory that sort of stayed with me. But as time went by, and when this Arms Act came in 1983, of course, Dad went through the licensing process. And he had a licence right up until You know, he had a license, a valid license, right up until he died, and that was in 1992. And I remember when he passed away, it was quite unexpected. He went into hospital for an operation and he didn't get through it. And I remember my mum being in an absolute panic, and I lived about 5 hours away by car at that stage, but I'd driven down there. She was in a panic that this firearm was still in the house that Dad owned, and he still actively used this firearm. You know, he'd go hunting for the duck shooting season and everything, and she was in an absolute panic about having this firearm in the house. And I says to her, don't worry, I'll make sure I'll get rid of it for you. And she was also worried because she knew that people knew that there was a firearm in the house, that Dad had a firearm. And with him no longer there, she felt a wee bit sort of unsafe knowing that there was a firearm, and in case anybody who was a bit unsavoury come into the house and tried to get the firearm. So I ended up taking it back with me, back to where I lived. And when I got back, I remember wrapping it up in a blanket and carrying it under my arm from the car into a gun shop. And I walked in there and I put this thing on the counter, and I just said to the guy, I said, can we get rid of this? It was my dad's and he's just passed away and Mum wants to get rid of it. And I'd taken his license with me, and so I had to present the license to the gun shop owner, and he said, yep, that's fine. And so he went through the process of getting the gun sold and everything that was required. But I just remember that it was, you know, when we were kids, it was sort of so loose about what you could do with a firearm to when it got to the stage where I had to get rid of this one for Dad or for Mum. And, you know, I was scared to be walking around the street with it. So, as I say, I wrapped it up in a blanket and sort of carried it under my arm and hoped nobody realised what it was, because I couldn't get a park right outside the shop. So that was a bit of an issue, I remember, with trying to get rid of a firearm. So, yeah, but just going back to the idea of New Zealand being a gun-free or a firearm-free country, it's not a firearm-free, but there's no such thing as, carry permits or anything like that, and there is a very harsh restriction on the type of weapons that you can have, and people just don't care. We don't really care. The advantage that we have here too is that we don't have any predator animals. Now, I could understand in America where people go into the bush or into the forest or something like that and being confronted with a bear or, you know, wildcat or something like that. We don't have anything like that here. We've got no predator animals at all. And so when you can go walking into the bush, into the, you know, forest or whatever it is here, and not have any fear that you're going to be attacked by any wild animals. The only thing that you do have to be a bit careful of is wild pigs. Now, wild pigs, people here go pig hunting for wild pigs. And you've got to be very careful, and you have to be experienced as a pig hunter, because a pig hunter will usually have pig dogs that are trained as hunting dogs for hunting pigs. And I used to work in a vet clinic at one stage, and I've seen so many cases of pig dogs coming into the vet clinic with ripped down the sides, and a wild boar will attack them and sort of rip a hole in the side of their skin, and they can be very aggressive if they're attacked, if they're approached, or if anyone's trying to hunt them. But most of the time, if they, you know, they'll scuttle off, just, you know, if they hear anything that they're not sort of concerned, that doesn't concern them. But when they know that they're being hunted, especially if a dog is getting them cornered, then they will lash out and be quite quite aggressive. The other group of hunters that we have in the country are deer stalkers. Deer in our hills, also like wild goats, can be very destructive, and there is a deer stalking association here in New Zealand, and there are lots and lots of people, mostly with a farming background, but not exclusively, that go deer stalking. And that's another reason why people have firearms to use when they go deer stalking. But it's only like hunting and sport and things like that. We don't need to have them here as protection. Nobody has a firearm in the house as protection. You wouldn't get a license, I'm pretty sure, if that was what you wanted a firearm for. I believe you would have to have a good reason, and as well as that, you have to go through this very strict police checking. They check your house, as I said, and it's quite a rigorous process, being in a position where you can actually own a firearm. So just based on that, I just thought it was just something worth having a bit of a talk about, to dispel the myth, I think, that we keep saying that we don't have firearms, but we do, and they have a purpose, but there is very, very strict control on ownership. And I'm not saying that there aren't lawbreakers out there, because there are, but they are handled very, very strongly by the law when they are caught. Anyone that's in a possession of an illegal firearm is, that's bad news as far as the police are concerned. So based on that, as I said, we only really have the firearms for people that have gone through the checks and they have a genuine purpose for having a firearm. And what that leads to, of course, is probably getting back to the old elephant in the room. Our kids don't have to worry going to school that somebody's going to come in with a firearm and devastate the school and cause injuries and fatalities and things like that. So that for us is a good thing, and I guess that's why we try and say this, we're a no-gun country or a no-firearm country. We say it probably meaning that we don't have our kids living in fear every time they go to school. And that there is so important. I went to school, never had a fear. My kids went to school, there was never a fear of firearms. My grandkids went to school, never had a fear of firearms. And I don't know anywhere in the country where there is any fear of anyone going into a school with a firearm. So as long as we keep thinking that we're a no firearm country and we can protect our kids with that belief, then I think it can only be a good result. So that's my little talk on firearms. I'm not quite sure if YouTube will let me publish this. I'll probably get a lot of clicks and whatever saying I've got to edit bits and pieces, and if I do, well, so be it. But hopefully I'll be able to post something that will be informative and that will get the message across as to how our country, of only 5.5 million, I have to say that, we're only a 5 million population, how we handle and cope with the situation of firearms. So that's my little talk for the day. Thank you for watching this. Sorry I have to be sitting in the car here with sunglasses on, but the sun is very bright out there. And it's very windy. It's a wee bit calmer now than when I arrived, but it is still very windy. And I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe got something out of it. If so, please feel free to like, comment, share, and even subscribe to my channel. I would appreciate that very much. Thank you. Now, stay safe, everybody. Take care. Bye.